Bonus: The Man Who Fell to Earth, 1976. Among the many cult classics of the 1970s, The Man Who Fell to Earth occupies a uniquely unsettling place, not because of what it shows, but because of what it seems to echo from real experimental research that existed only briefly before disappearing. The film's portrayal of advanced energy transmission, biological adaptation under foreign environmental pressures, and exotic material engineering reflects several speculative research tracks pursued during the early to mid-70s. At the time, government and private sector laboratories were exploring prototypes for high-efficiency energy conduits, long-range signal compression, and bioadaptive stress modeling. Some of these studies were publicly referenced in small technical bulletins, though often described in deliberately vague language. What makes the connection so intriguing is how closely certain designs in the film resemble diagrams from a little-known experimental proposal on coherent energy transfer mediums. The proposal circulated briefly at an academic conference in 1974 before being withdrawn from publication. Attendees later recalled sketches of a lattice-like transmission core that matched elements seen in the film's alien technology. Copies of the proposal, never digitized, reportedly vanished from institutional archives by the early 1980s. David Bowie's character, an extraterrestrial trapped between worlds, frequently interacts with devices incorporating layered, translucent structures that reflect optical manipulation concepts similar to prototypes developed under a classified materials program. A physicist who advised on the film later mentioned he had shown the production team obsolete drafts from a research group studying exotic refractive composites. When asked years later to elaborate, he answered simply, "Those drafts aren't accessible anymore." Perhaps the most enigmatic detail is the film's subtle depiction of a communication system using compressed multispectrum bursts, a concept identical to a defunct research effort focused on ultra-dense signal encoding. The team behind that effort dissolved shortly after the project was absorbed into a broader, classified initiative. There are moments in the history of science when the future seems to drift a little too close, when a discovery appears, flickers for a moment, and then vanishes behind a veil of silence. Sometimes it disappears because it failed, sometimes because it succeeded a little too well, and sometimes because someone decided the world wasn't ready to know what had been found. Hollywood has always drawn power from this boundary between what is known and what is forbidden. Sci-fi films borrow ideas from laboratories, defense programs, unpublished studies, and experimental theories drifting on the edge of legitimacy. Most of the time, these inspirations remain harmless footnotes. But every so often, the research behind a film becomes the kind of thing governments prefer not to discuss. Papers sealed, projects renamed, researchers reassigned, entire archives quietly reorganized. In these rare moments, the film itself becomes a strange artifact, a surviving fragment of research that no longer officially exists. Dialogues, echoing phrasing from papers that vanished, designs based on prototypes that were never acknowledged. Scientific advisors who declined to be interviewed years later, or were removed from the credits altogether. Studios that once boasted about their realism suddenly refusing to comment on where their technical information came from. This episode opens the vault on 15 sci-fi films that touch something real, something grounded in actual research, only for that research to be classified, restricted, or quietly buried after the movie was released. Some coincidences can be explained. Others feel like glimpses of a world we were never meant to see. In the end, the question is not whether these films predicted the future, but whether they briefly revealed a truth that someone later decided should stay hidden. 1. The Matrix, 1999. The Matrix is often discussed for its philosophical depth, but its depiction of neural interfacing, sensory virtualization, and full environment simulation is rooted in real computational neuroscience research that was much more accessible in the 1990 seconds than it is today. At the time, several cognitive labs pursued early-stage neural mapping attempts to decode sensory input pathways and reconstruct simplified perceptual fields. These efforts were documented in conference papers exploring coherent perception reconstruction and neurosynthetic signal substitution. Yet, after the film's explosive popularity, many of these studies disappeared from public access. Several labs shifted their focus, removing earlier publications from open databases. A cluster of research on multi-layered sensory simulation was reclassified under an institutional directive that offered no public explanation. More intriguing is how the film's digital environment resembles experimental, closed-loop, immersive systems described in a small set of late 90s research proposals. These proposals involved real-time neural signal interpretation coupled with adaptive simulation engines, a combination eerily similar to the Matrix's foundational idea. The proposals existed briefly in academic repositories before being pulled for incomplete review, never to return. The film's iconic neural jack ports parallel a conceptual design found in an internal report on cortical interface docking. This report circulated among neuroscience graduate students before being sealed into restricted archives following a funding transition. A technical advisor who initially consulted on the film later declined to discuss the origin of certain neural visualization sequences. When questioned, he said only, "The models we referenced are no longer part of the public academic landscape." Even the film's depiction of digital déjà vu glitches arising from environmental recomputation resembles speculative notes from early simulation theory workshops, which ceased publication after 2001. Today, The Matrix acts as a cinematic echo of research pathways that drifted out of the public sphere. Its simulated reality may be fiction, but many of the scientific primitives behind it were once real research trajectories that quietly migrated into classified, proprietary, or otherwise inaccessible domains shortly after the world saw their fictionalized reflection. To Moon, 2009. Moon gained acclaim for its haunting story of isolation, but the deeper thread running through the film cloning, workforce replication, and identity continuity intersects with real experimental biology that, for a short time, appeared to be inching toward controversial territory. In the mid-2000s, several labs explored the feasibility of accelerated cloning cycles, epigenetic memory imprinting, and rapid tissue maturation techniques. Much of this work was available in specialized journals before abruptly shrinking from public visibility. During production, the filmmakers reportedly consulted with researchers studying somatic cell reprogramming and stability thresholds for artificially matured tissues. These studies centered on methods for preserving cognitive continuity across biological duplicates, research considered theoretical, yet surprisingly detailed in internal symposium papers. Several of these documents disappeared by the early 2010s, replaced by vague abstracts hinting at non-public experimental frameworks. The film's depiction of memory inheritance, the idea that multiple clones can share baseline experiences, echoes a set of disputed experiments on epigenetic memory markers conducted at a European lab in 2007. Notes from the project circulated briefly online before vanishing. Some researchers affiliated with the lab later stated that results were reabsorbed into private sector initiatives. Even more striking is the film's presentation of accelerated organ repair for the clones, mirroring techniques described in a proposal known as rapid cellular integration, which was withdrawn from publication shortly after peer review. The proposal's disappearance was never explained. One of the film's early scientific advisors, a developmental biologist, withdrew from post-release commentary, citing obligations related to ongoing projects with updated access restrictions. Today, Moon feels less like speculative fiction and more like an eerie reflection of biotechnological ambitions that were once publicly debated before slipping behind the closed doors of private or classified research programs. Its lonely lunar facility preserves the shadows of experiments that became too ethically charged to remain visible. 3. Interstellar, 2014. Interstellar is celebrated for its emotional sweep, but its scientific framework is far more revealing than most viewers realize. The film's depiction of wormholes, gravitational anomalies, and higher dimensional geometry mirrors several advanced theoretical models pursued by research teams in the early 2010s. During development, Christopher Nolan's team consulted physicists who were exploring exotic spacetime metrics and gravitational lensing equations far more sophisticated than what appeared in public textbooks. Some of these studies were funded through broad-spectrum astrophysics grants, whose details were openly published at first. Not long after the film's release, a number of associated research documents quietly vanished from academic repositories. Papers discussing nonlinear gravitational tunneling, recursive temporal anchoring, and cross-dimensional curvature mapping were withdrawn for revisions that never reappeared. In some cases, entire project descriptions were replaced with redacted notices citing classification compliance updates. The film's visualization of the wormhole interior is particularly uncanny. It closely resembles diagrams from a theoretical proposal reportedly submitted to a federal research agency in 2011 diagrams involving folding vectors and rotational symmetry fields. Those proposals, once listed in public grant databases, were removed by 2016. One consultant later hinted that the film's spherical wormhole borrowed from early-stage models that are not in circulation anymore. Even more intriguing is the film's portrayal of tesseract-like structures encoding temporal information. These sequences align with speculative frameworks on time-indexed data fields and multidimensional state representation topics once debated in niche conferences. Records of these discussions became scarce after 2015. A scientific advisor originally involved in developing the film's gravitational equations declined all post-release interviews. When asked whether the film's physics were purely theoretical, he answered, "The version you saw is theoretical. The version we discussed isn't available for public review anymore." Today, Interstellar endures not simply as fiction, but as a cinematic relic, capturing research trajectories that briefly surfaced before being absorbed into classified or internal-only astrophysics programs, its cosmic imagery preserving concepts no longer openly acknowledged. 4. The Terminator, 1984. Although The Terminator is framed as a sci-fi action film about a hostile AI from the future, its depiction of autonomous military systems reflects emerging research from the early 1980 seconds research that, at the time, was partially visible in academic and defense publications. Several laboratories were experimenting with early autonomous targeting modules, adaptive control loops, and machine vision heuristics intended to guide semi-independent robotic platforms. These systems were crude compared to modern standards, but they represented the first attempts at reducing human oversight in battlefield robotics. Initially, some documentation of this research was openly available. Papers discussed isolated decision modules, self-correcting sensor analysis, and adaptive threat prioritization. But in the years following the film's release, much of this work was quietly restructured. Titles were changed, research groups dissolved, papers disappeared from university databases, sometimes resurfacing later with heavily edited abstracts that omitted earlier technical details. What draws particular attention is the film's portrayal of machine vision targeting overlays, an interface design that closely resembles experimental visual recognition systems tested in the early 80 seconds. A set of internal prototypes leaked online years later showed crosshair matrices and heat signature filtering almost identical to those featured in the movie's Terminator point-of-view shots. Those images were removed within hours, leaving behind only second-hand descriptions. Another unexplained detail involves a robotics engineer credited in early promotional materials but absent from the final credits. Colleagues later claimed he had contributed insights from a defense project that underwent classification review, after which he stopped speaking publicly about his work. The film's core idea, an AI reaching autonomous military command capability, mirrors speculative memos circulated among defense analysts during the period. These memos vanished from archives by the late 80 seconds. Today, the Terminator stands not as a prophecy, but as a distorted echo of early autonomous weapons research. Its fictional apocalypse may have been exaggerated, but the scientific foundation beneath it traces back to research efforts that drifted into classified territory shortly after Hollywood brought a version of them to screen. 5. War Games 1983. Though War Games is remembered as a Cold War thriller about a teenager accidentally accessing a military computer, the film's central technology, an automated decision system for nuclear escalation, was grounded in real research underway during the late 1970 seconds and early 1980 seconds. At the time, several defense think tanks and computational labs were experimenting with strategic automation frameworks, early attempts to offload aspects of high-pressure military decision-making to predictive algorithms. These frameworks explored real-time threat assessment, escalation, probability mapping, and automated scenario resolution. For a few years, limited documentation of these experiments existed in public records. White paper outlines described concepts eerily similar to the film's WOPR system, including multi-branch scenario wargaming and recursive decision tree simulations. But shortly after the film's release and the public conversation, it provoked many of these documents disappeared or were reissued with altered terminology. Programs once referenced by name were reclassified under vague designations, and entire research summaries were removed from digital archives. The most unsettling overlap lies in the film's portrayal of the game theory loop, which mirrors an actual experiment involving continuous reiteration of conflict outcomes to identify stable endpoints. A 1979 report describing this model was available for several years before being absorbed into a classified review cycle. When researchers were asked about the report decades later, most said they could not confirm the document's current status. Another curious detail, early drafts of wargames included highly specific visualizations of escalation matrices that were later toned down. A technical advisor allegedly requested their removal, stating that the graphics resembled displays used in a restricted prototype interface. One of the film's consultants, a mathematician specializing in strategic modeling, vanished from public academic involvement shortly afterward, leaving behind no explanation for his sudden withdrawal. Today, Wargames feels like an accidental exposure of early command automation research, capturing the outlines of systems that quietly disappeared behind security classifications soon after the world saw a fictional version of them in action. 6. Edge of Tomorrow, 2014. Edge of Tomorrow may look like a high-concept time-loop action film, but its depiction of combat prediction systems draws striking parallels to real military simulation research that briefly surfaced in the late 2000s. During production, the creative team consulted defense analysts and simulation engineers familiar with advanced battlefield forecasting models, systems designed to map probable combat outcomes based on vast streams of sensor, drone, and environmental data. These early prototypes aimed to simulate thousands of parallel micro-scenarios to predict the most advantageous responses for soldiers on the ground. For a short period, several of these research efforts were publicly documented. Papers discussing temporal variant clustering, reversible scenario modeling, and adaptive tactical recomputation appeared in specialized military journals. But within a few years of the film's release, many of these publications were quietly withdrawn, replaced with generic citations indicating that the research had moved into classified operational frameworks. Some conference presentations that once included technical diagrams now list only their titles, with full text no longer available. The film's time loop narrative obviously dramatizes these ideas, yet its depiction of combat units responding to constantly recalculated optimal paths resembles real predictive adaptation modules rumored to have been tested during early simulations. One advisor hinted that certain on-screen tactical displays were inspired by prototypes never shown publicly, but demonstrated in controlled access meetings. If every 3 wands, end quote. More cryptic is the resemblance between the Mimic's swarm response behavior and a now-lost research project exploring emergent coordination in autonomous battlefield drones. Diagrams leaked in 2011 showed multi-vector convergence patterns, nearly identical to those visualized in the film. Those diagrams vanished from the public domain almost immediately. A consultant involved early in production later declined interviews, stating only that some of the simulation models referenced shifted into program phases not open for academic review. Today, Edge of Tomorrow stands as a surreal reflection of tactical forecasting concepts that were once briefly visible before being sealed away, its looping battles echoing research glimpses that slipped into restricted silence. 7. Transcendence, 2014. Transcendence presents a radical vision of consciousness uploaded into a digital substrate, but its foundations lie closer to real experimental neuroscience than most audiences realize. In the early 2010 seconds, researchers were exploring high-resolution neural mapping, cortical state preservation, and large-scale simulation of interconnected neural networks. These studies were part of publicly funded cognitive architecture programs seeking to understand the structure of consciousness, not replicate it, but model aspects of its distribution and memory formation. However, shortly after the film's release, multiple research groups connected to high-density neural scanning changed direction unexpectedly. several early papers on persistent state neural replication were removed from digital archives, with some replaced by significantly abbreviated summaries. A dataset documenting long-term neural pattern stabilization rumored to have been shared with consultants during production was reclassified and restricted to internal access only. No public explanation followed. The film's depiction of recursively self-improving intelligence echoes a series of theoretical exercises circulated among cognitive scientists around 2012. These exercises proposed that a sufficiently detailed neural model, once simulated, could begin generating independent cognitive structures. Though speculative, their existence was acknowledged in workshop reports that stopped being published after 2015. Even more intriguing is the film's visual representation of neural lattices, complex, branching networks that resemble high-fidelity connectome models used in early simulation experiments. One technical advisor claimed that these designs were based on unpublished drafts he had glimpsed during collaborations, drafts that later shifted out of public view. Another advisor quietly withdrew from promotional interviews, stating that current research trends made the film uncomfortably close to conversations we're no longer allowed to have. Today, Transcendence reads like a cinematic relic of a moment when neuroscience briefly brushed against the possibility of digital consciousness before much of the underlying research quietly migrated into classified or corporate privatized domains, leaving only fragments embedded within a sci-fi narrative. 8. Minority Report, 2002. Although Minority Report is remembered for its futuristic action, its predictive policing core is strikingly close to several early behavioral forecasting models developed at the turn of the millennium. During pre-production, the filmmakers were given access to emerging research in pattern extraction, algorithmic inference, and socio-behavioral trend modeling, much of which was still in exploratory phases. These projects focused on anticipating criminal or anomalous behavior through layered data inputs, long before the public fully understood concepts like behavioral analytics or predictive artificial intelligence. What is rarely mentioned is that early drafts of the film used diagrams based on a real research framework involving multi-axis situational mapping. This framework appeared briefly in public white papers before being redirected into government-funded studies that no longer disclosed progression reports. By 2004, several of the papers originally cited as background references were removed from open-access journals, replaced with citations indicating that material has been archived for internal review. The film's gesture-based interfaces, while iconic, also bear resemblance to prototypes developed under a lab investigating human-machine pre-visualization systems. These prototypes were said to combine gesture recognition with predictive path modeling to simulate potential real-time outcomes. Shortly after the movie's release, the lab's research focus shifted away from predictive modeling, and references to these prototypes disappeared from annual summaries. More eerie is the similarity between the pre-crime visualizations and a set of experimental probability mapping displays leaked in 2003. The displays used glowing nodes and branching outcome lines nearly identical to the sequences in the film. The documents were removed within days, with no archived copies available. 9. Ex Machina, 2014. Ex Machina is widely praised for its intimate portrayal of artificial intelligence, but beneath the film's sleek minimalism lies a surprisingly direct connection to early research on emergent cognition and autonomous behavioral modeling. During its development, the filmmakers consulted AI researchers who had been experimenting with deep recursive networks capable of generating independent heuristic strategies, systems that, at the time, were only loosely documented in public papers. These prototypes attempted to produce unsupervised emotional inference, intention, prediction, and adaptive conversational structures. Shortly after the film was released, several of the research groups associated with these early models underwent abrupt restructuring. Their pre-publication drafts, once accessible in academic repositories, became restricted or were replaced with heavily edited versions. One paper describing self-modifying cognitive scaffolds, which had circulated informally among AI researchers in 2013, vanished entirely from university archives by 2016. What makes Ex Machina especially unsettling is its portrayal of nonverbal inference, Ava's ability to read micro-expressions, posture shifts, and micro-delays in human speech. These details align closely with a real predictive behavior algorithm tested in the early 2010 seconds under a project aiming to classify human emotional states from high-resolution video data. Public references to this project ceased 3 years after preliminary findings were announced. Another connection lies in the film's depiction of Neural Blue Book, mapping a fictional parallel to a rumored dataset combining location logs, search histories, and linguistic patterns to create behavioral maps. A consultant for the film later admitted that certain visualization sequences were based on research we were encouraged not to cite directly. One of the most cryptic elements involves a technical advisor who withdrew his name from the credits. Colleagues later said he had been involved with an AI simulation program that pivoted into a classified application. Today, Ex Machina feels less like speculative fiction and more like a dramatization of early breakthroughs that drifted into restricted research domains. It offers a haunting glimpse of the moment when AI began shifting from academic curiosity to something greatly monitored, carefully contained, and no longer openly discussed. 10. Upgrade 2018. Upgrade is often praised for its sleek, brutal depiction of a human enhanced by an embedded neurocontrol chip. But behind the film's stylized violence lies an unsettling resemblance to several real neural interface prototypes that were being explored in the mid-2010 seconds. During development, the filmmakers consulted with engineers and neurologists working on early versions of high-bandwidth cortical implants, closed-loop motor assistance, and adaptive neuroprosthetics capable of interpreting intention signals. Many of these technologies were part of publicly known research programs at the time, supported by both civilian institutions and defense-adjacent partnerships. Yet in the years following the movie's release, information about some of these projects became increasingly difficult to access. A series of research papers on motor intention decoding and autonomous signal correction disappeared from online journals, replaced with notices citing access restructuring. Several labs that once openly discussed high-density neural recording shifted their publications to focus on safer topics, such as rehabilitation assistive devices. What connects Upgrade more disturbingly to real research is its depiction of implanted systems capable of autonomous decision-making, a concept suspiciously similar to a prototype neural module rumored to have been tested under a defense research initiative. The film shows the implant overriding human hesitation and generating optimized responses in real time. This mirrors the functionality described in a set of internal presentations leaked briefly online in 2016, dealing with dynamic threat response augmentation. These documents vanished within days. One of the technical advisors originally attached to the film later declined all interviews and requested not to be credited. Crew members recalled him referencing datasets and neural mapping models that weren't supposed to be publicly discussed yet. 11. The Fly, 1986. While The Fly is remembered for its visceral horror and body transformation sequences, the film's underlying scientific backbone is far more grounded in actual molecular biology research than most viewers realize. In the early 1980 seconds, several research groups were investigating proto-teleportation analogs, not the literal movement of matter, but theoretical models for breaking down complex biological structures into informational states. This work explored molecular pattern preservation, cellular reassembly, and high-fidelity structural mapping. At the time, these studies were publicly accessible, appearing in university research discussions surrounding biotransference theory. However, shortly after the film's release, many documents connected to these experiments became difficult to obtain. Some of the earliest frameworks for molecular deconstruction protocols were republished with redacted sections. Other papers were withdrawn entirely, replaced with vague statements about methodological inconsistencies. Researchers who had discussed these ideas openly in seminars stopped referencing them altogether. What makes the connection even stranger is how the film's teleportation pods replicate the architecture of a real experimental apparatus used for micropattern analysis during the early 80 seconds. The hexagonal lattice structures featured in the device's interior match sketches found in a dissertation on biological data, imprinting a dissertation that quietly disappeared from its university archive sometime in the late 90 seconds. A biophysics consultant briefly credited in early publicity materials was later removed from all official documentation. Colleagues claimed he had been involved in a project exploring high-density biological scanning, funded by an agency known for absorbing smaller research efforts into classified programs. When asked about his work on the movie, he reportedly answered, "We were closer to something real than anyone expected, and then the work shifted direction." Though The Fly dramatizes its science into nightmare fuel, the foundation beneath it stems from research that vanished soon after. It's as if the film accidentally immortalized experimental concepts that became too sensitive to remain openly documented scientific ghosts trapped within a cinematic transformation. 12 Gattaca, 1997. When Gattaca premiered in 1997, audiences saw it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of genetic perfection. But buried beneath its narrative of engineered identity lies a quietly unsettling overlap with early-stage genetic research that was, at the time, still openly discussed in scientific circles only to be sealed or quietly redirected in the years following the film's release. During production, the filmmakers consulted researchers exploring somatic line editing, probabilistic gene mapping, and early frameworks for what would later become known as predictive phenotype modeling. These studies were largely theoretical in the mid-90s, appearing in niche academic journals and symposium notes about speculative biomedical futures. Yet, as the decade closed, multiple early publications on pre-birth genetic selection methodologies vanished from public databases. Some were replaced by redacted summaries. Others were folded into new research groups with funding lines that no longer disclosed participation details. One lab involved in early genome selection modeling, a group rumored to have exchanged emails with the film's advisory team, was abruptly reorganized under a new institutional designation, with its archived materials restricted indefinitely. What alarms historians of science is how precisely Gattaca depicts feasibility thresholds for gene-based risk assessments. These were not widely known outside a handful of research departments. Several diagrams shown in the film, including probability matrices and viability ranking charts, match figures from papers that later disappeared from circulation. Even the film's language terms like valid, degenerate, and preferred genome alignment echoes phrasing found in a now-lost draft of a genetic viability proposal dated 1996. Interviews with certain biomedical advisors from the film dried up in the early 2000s. One researcher, approached for a retrospective, simply replied, "I can't discuss the material we were referencing back then. It's no longer in the public sphere." 13 Contact 1997. Contact is remembered for its emotional depth, but beneath its narrative lies an infrastructure of physics, engineering, and energy transfer concepts that aligned suspiciously well with several real research proposals from the early 1990s. During production, the filmmakers consulted multiple scientists working in high-energy particle research and theoretical propulsion. At the time, several of these studies were openly published under exploratory programs focused on nonlinear space-time modeling and high-density energy conversion. But within 2 years of the film's release, nearly all references to certain prototypes and mathematical frameworks used to build the movie's iconic machine were either removed from public access or absorbed into broader classified research clusters. One particular set of diagrams, the ones showing rotational energy routing, magnetic field stabilization, and interdimensional probability modeling, were nearly identical to figures from a little-known research proposal submitted to a government agency in 1993. That proposal, publicly available for a short time, vanished from digital and physical archives around 1999. Even more mysterious was the disappearance of a technical consultant credited in early production notes but absent from the final release. According to a crew member, he abruptly withdrew during post-production after being asked to discontinue involvement. The film's depiction of complex energy harmonics oscillating structures that resemble nested toroidal fields corresponded to theoretical constructs later rumored to be part of classified propulsion studies. The studio claimed these details were purely speculative, yet internal memos from the era suggest the writers were given access to non-standard models to ensure scientific plausibility. Years later, Carl Sagan's own notes hint at conversations with researchers who were not fully able to discuss their work, particularly those involved with early high-energy field experiments. 14 The Forbin Project 1970. On the surface, Colossus, The Forbin project is a cautionary tale about an autonomous defense computer gaining control over global nuclear systems. But the deeper you look, the more the film resembles a dramatized blueprint of early command automation models that were being explored inside U.S. defense research just before the film's release. In the late 1960 seconds, several experimental programs investigated ways to reduce human delay in high-stakes military responses. These studies explored automated threat analysis, rapid response logic trees, and predictive escalation modeling research that officially remained unclassified until the mid-1970 seconds. But shortly after the film premiered, much of this material was abruptly reclassified. Papers that had been available to graduate students were moved behind restricted access walls. Presentations from defense conferences disappeared from public proceedings. Even references to systemic autonomous oversight, a term used in consulting documents for the film, were replaced in later publications with ambiguous phrasing like advanced monitoring frameworks. What unsettled historians is how closely the film's Colossus system mirrors the decision matrix structure found in a series of real computational models developed at the time, including one prototype known internally as AMP42. Early drafts of the Colossus script included diagrams that looked nearly identical to flowcharts from these programs, charts that were not publicly acknowledged until decades later. Dr. Charles Wright, a mathematician rumored to have provided off-record guidance to the filmmakers, was later linked to a defense contractor specializing in automated command control. When a reporter attempted to discuss his involvement, he replied simply, "The project you're asking about no longer exists in a form I can talk about." By the early 1980 seconds, almost all early research on autonomous strategic computation had been reorganized, renamed, or erased from public archives. And yet Colossus remains, eerily accurate and unsettlingly specific, as if it captured an early snapshot of a classified technological ambition, one that stepped too close to reality for comfort. 15. The Andromeda Strain, 1971. When the Andromeda Strain was released in 1971, it was praised for its almost unsettling accuracy in depicting biocontainment protocols, molecular analysis, and emergency response procedures to an extraterrestrial pathogen. What the public didn't know was that Michael Crichton had been in contact with several biomedical researchers who were quietly working with early-stage defense studies involving high-risk microorganisms and containment models for unknown biological agents. At the time, these projects were technically open, referenced under vague umbrella programs designed to test environmental resilience and microbial adaptation. Yet, in the years immediately following the film's release, many of the papers Crichton had once mentioned in interviews were removed from public archives. Some disappeared from university libraries. Others were absorbed into reorganized federal programs with new designations and restricted access levels. A research team from Arizona State University, who had been proud of contributing early data to the film's advisors, suddenly went silent. Their published studies from the late 1960 seconds were retracted without explanation or replaced by sanitized abstracts that no longer referenced original experimental methods. Even more curious was the film's astonishingly precise depiction of automated laboratory systems, submicron filtration, controlled decontamination, and remote mechanical manipulation. These technologies did not exist in any public documentation until nearly a decade later. When questioned, the studio's technical consultant insisted the designs were dramatic extrapolations, yet later admitted he could not legally verify their origins. The strangest part came when a journalist attempted to interview one of the original scientific advisors in the early 1990 seconds. He declined, stating only that the data no longer belongs to history. Today, the Andromeda Strain feels less like fiction and more like an artifact from a scientific timeline that someone quietly rewrote. The film preserved the shape of a theory that was later sealed away, an accidental snapshot of research that vanished into classified channels shortly after it was glimpsed. Bonus: The Man Who Fell to Earth, 1976. Among the many cult classics of the 1970 seconds, The Man Who Fell to Earth occupies a uniquely unsettling place, not because of what it shows, but because of what it seems to echo from real experimental research that existed only briefly before disappearing. The film's portrayal of advanced energy transmission, biological adaptation under foreign environmental pressures, and exotic material engineering reflects several speculative research tracks pursued during the early to mid-70s. At the time, government and private sector laboratories were exploring prototypes for high-efficiency energy conduits, long-range signal compression, and bioadaptive stress modeling. Some of these studies were publicly referenced in small technical bulletins, though often described in deliberately vague language. What makes the connection so intriguing is how closely certain designs in the film resemble diagrams from a little-known experimental proposal on coherent energy transfer mediums. The proposal circulated briefly at an academic conference in 1974 before being withdrawn from publication. Attendees later recalled sketches of a lattice-like transmission core that matched elements seen in the film's alien technology. Copies of the proposal, never digitized, reportedly vanished from institutional archives by the early 1980s. David Bowie's character, an extraterrestrial trapped between worlds, frequently interacts with devices incorporating layered, translucent structures that reflect optical manipulation concepts similar to prototypes developed under a classified materials program. A physicist who advised on the film later mentioned he had shown the production team obsolete drafts from a research group studying exotic refractive composites. When asked years later to elaborate, he answered simply, "Those drafts aren't accessible anymore." Perhaps the most enigmatic detail is the film's subtle depiction of a communication system using compressed, multi-spectrum bursts, a concept identical to a defunct research effort focused on ultra-dense signal encoding. The team behind that effort dissolved shortly after the project was absorbed into a broader classified initiative. Today, The Man Who Fell to Earth remains a strange cinematic fossil, preserving glimpses of experimental technologies that briefly surfaced in the scientific record before fading into classified obscurity. If these films truly preserved fragments of research that later vanished into sealed archives, then each one is more than fiction. They're the last surviving traces of ideas someone decided the world shouldn't examine too closely. And if a movie can capture even a shadow of classified science, it makes you wonder what else might already be hidden in plain sight. If you want more deep dives into suppressed technology, erased experiments, and the films that accidentally exposed them, subscribe to Vaulted Futures and step deeper into the archives Hollywood never meant you to open.